Chapter 5 of Fact Stranger Than Fiction by John Patterson Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Home again. Returning to Cleveland from Troy Hill in the summer of 1862, I found employment with the East Cleveland Street Railway Company in its barn, located at Euclid and Wilson Avenues, now East 55th Street. My specific duties were to wash, comb, rub down, and harness 9 streetcar horses, but for the reason that I feared the effect of the constant dust on my lungs, I did not remain there longer than a week or two. To please my mother, who desired that I should follow in the footsteps of my father and learn the tailor's trade, I went into the employ of Mr. Henry Cardozo, a merchant tailor in Prospect Avenue, near its junction with Bolivar Road. Mr. Cardozo was affable and kind, and used his best endeavors to induct me into the mysteries of his useful trade. But, alas, I soon discovered that his efforts in that behalf were all to no purpose, for although I proved an apt pupil during the 3 months which I spent in his employ, learned to make ordinary pants and vests, yet so stiffened had my joints become, by reason of the protracted labour which I had performed, that I could not bend the supple hinges of my knees, and squat on the work-board when I was sewing, and in my efforts to do so the strain was so severe on both knees and back, that I sewed in continual pain. The result is easily seen. I quit the services of Mr. Cardozo, and quite easily betook myself to the calling of a hotel waiter. My dear mother protested against this action on my part, but as we both well knew that the payments must be kept up on the little home, it was no time for the drawing of nice distinctions, and so I entered the old Angier house, now the Kennard house, and donned my white jacket and apron, the pure symbols of my occupation. I was a novice at the work, and since in those days that hotel took first rank amongst the other hostelries of the growing city, the menus were in French, a language with which I was not in the least familiar. The head waiter at that time was Mr. Enoch Gray, who resembled a white man. He understood all the duties pertaining to his responsible position, and was a veritable martinet in enforcing the execution of all his rules. I suspect it was my scrutinizing of Mr. Gray which caused me to slip and spill the consommé which I was serving guests on the floor of the richly frescoed dining-room, to say nothing of my extreme chagrin at being sprawled on the same. It was frequently necessary for a waiter during the rush hour to memorize the French orders of 6 and 7 guests at one time. I did it, but how in the world I ever accomplished it is beyond my ken at this late date. The other boys did it, and I had to follow their example or quit, which was not to be considered for a moment. In due course of time I found myself performing the same functions at the Weddell House, but for increased pay, and later on, during the troublous days of the Civil War, I strove right manfully in the labours of feeding the boys in blue on the way to the front, at the call of Father Abraham, whom God had raised up for this work, in the dining-room of the first Union Depot, which gave way to the remnant of the present Union Depot about the year 1865. There were stirring scenes witnessed in that old depot in those trying times. During all hours of the day, and frequently at night, long serpentine trains would find their way into that shelter house, with their thousands of hungry and thirsty boys in blue, who had left all that the word home means to us in order to help to save our glorious Union. Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. And like brave men they did it. It was one of my duties to sound the big Chinese gong upon the arrival of trains, which I did with a will. Sometimes the racket was so great that a soldier would order me to cease it, sometimes, I must say, while being held up by the nape of my neck by a stalwart soldier. At other times there would be taken from an incoming train over the Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati Railroad boxes containing the remains of brave boys who had given their all for the dear old flag. Such was the case when the remains of Colonels Creighton and Crane were brought back to lie in state in the council chamber of the old City Hall, when it was located in a building still standing in the southwestern corner of the public square. Afterwards they were laid to rest with full military honors. At other times there would be alight from these trains the halt, the lame, and the blind victims of what General Sherman not improperly denominated hell. Another class were the almost skeletons of Union prisoners released from horrid prison pens of the Southern Confederacy. Some of these victims were so nearly starved to death and emaciated that they could not walk alone. In later years, while visiting North Baltimore, Ohio, for the purpose of making a Decoration Day speech, I conversed with one of these victims who survived, and he told me that before being confined in the Andersonville prison pen he weighed 185 pounds, but that when he was released therefrom a lady's bracelet could have been passed over his right arm from his wrist to his shoulder, with the elbow joint left out. The dining room was owned by Messrs. Wheeler and Russell. Mr. Wheeler was in immediate charge of it, while Mr. Russell presided over the one owned by them in Crestline, Ohio. There were at that time also 2 coffee houses, in one of which the late W. J. Akers, then a boy, was employed. Among the colored men generally known in Cleveland for many years and employed in and about the depot and dining room may be mentioned the late George Vosburgh. Mr. Vosburgh, though a colored man, was for many years one of the most respected men in the city. He owned valuable property in Chestnut and Oregon streets, and was a leading member of the Wesleyan congregation, which in those days worshipped in a church located in Euclid Avenue near Sheriff East 4th Street. The late Thorpe Holmes, colored, was head waiter in the dining room. He had under him a force of about 20 men, all of whom admired and respected him. This writer will always honor and revere his memory, on account of kindnesses extended to him by Mr. Holmes, which enabled him to prosecute his studies during the intervals between the trains without interruption. On many occasions he would call a man who was killing time by playing 7-up, picking on a banjo, or cutting the pigeon wing, as the dance was called, and send him on an errand, rather than interrupt the writer in the pursuit of his studies. In casting a retrospective glance over those bygone days, it is a sad commentary on the course pursued by that large group of colored men that this writer was the only one of them who systematically studied textbooks or even read history, and, sad to relate, the only one of them all who changed his career. Stimulated, as I have stated in the last chapter, by kind friends to study for the improvement of my mind, I constantly perused the 3 R's, studied English, Latin, and French grammars as best I could without a teacher, and thereby rapidly gained the goodwill of all who knew me. My slight knowledge of the Latin language was on a very important occasion a source of much pleasure to me, and information to a numerous group of persons who surrounded me. It was in this way. The remains of the late Abraham Lincoln were lying in state upon a catafalque near the center of our public square, and over the top of the catafalque was stretched a banner bearing the following inscription in Latin: Extinctus amabitur idem. All were anxious to know the meaning of those words, and ever and anon they would stop some important appearing man passing by and exclaim, "Say, mister, tell us what that means, will you?" Thereupon the gentleman would stop, read the words, and acknowledge his inability to translate the sentence. This was repeated several times, until finally I looked up from the grass upon which I was reclining, and said, "That's Latin. I can tell you what it means." "Who, you?" some one sarcastically growled. "Yes," I answered. "Well, what does it mean?" was the reply. "It means," I said, "though dead, he will be loved the same." Then for a moment I was the object of all eyes, and I felt that in the single act of translating that sentiment for the group, I had been richly repaid for all the study and self-denial I had endured in order to be able to do it. It was customary with me during this period of my life to write an occasional essay on some subject, abstract, concrete, moral, religious, or what not. Any subject that came within the scope of my young, untutored mind claimed my attention and occupied my time. One of the contributing reasons for this was the fact that in those days large and attentive audiences of my own people were ready and willing to listen to the reading of them, and manifested an enthusiasm which both astonished and inspired me. My revered and kind friend and Reverend John R. Warren stood in loco parentis to me, and his was the only fatherly voice that counseled me, and hand that led me through those days of mingled labors, conflicts, hopes deferred, and at times well nigh despair. My temperament was then as now too nervous. I was willing to work incessantly, to burn the midnight oil, ay, to burn the candle at both ends, if need be, in my feverish quest after knowledge. But I can see plainly now that I lacked a preceptor, someone who would, like Philip of old, expound to me the meaning of many things which I blindly followed but did not understand. I did not know really what books to select to read, and for the lack of a well-informed, educated mentor, I wasted much time in poring over books and languages which I was not then qualified to properly read and mentally digest. However, my dear friend Elder Warren, who was then the elder in charge of this district and of St. John's African Methodist Church, but who, like me, had enjoyed only limited opportunities of gaining an education, by his high regard for me and admiration for my efforts along that line, greatly encouraged and aided me. It was he who advised me to read Rollin's Ancient History, which I had not previously heard of, and which opened to my eyes so many of the mysteries of the past, and the same fatherly regard for me induced him to open wide for me the doors of his church, where I read my laboured essays on occasions when there were gatherings of the young therein. Had my father lived to rear me and advise me in respect of these matters, I would not today be limping along the highway to knowledge, when I should be running and leaping. As an illustration of the interest taken in me by one of the boys who waited by my side in the old dining room, I will here relate an incident which I shall ever hold in grateful remembrance, since it was the outflowing of a heart full of fraternal love and sympathy. Mr. Joseph H. Ricks, the youthful heir of a recently deceased father, had in possession the sum of $1,000, which he had received as his portion of his father's estate, and feeling that he had no present use for the money, he generously and unselfishly came to me and tried to persuade me to accept the same as a loan, and without any security or interest whatever, to be used by me in forwarding my neglected education. To say that I was greatly surprised at this manifestation of unadulterated friendship only partly expresses my feeling at that time, and I have never ceased to wonder at the whole-souled magnanimity of this big-hearted country boy. Would that there were more of his kind to make the whole world kin, and add to our mutual helpfulness and happiness. At length, after nearly 7 years of yearning and toil, we saw the last payment made on our humble home, the deed executed and delivered, and the mortgage burned. Now dear mother was assured of a comfortable home during the remainder of her life, and I was left free to shift for myself. During all the years while I had been working for the purchase of this property, my energetic honourable sisters, Miss Sarah Rice Green, now Skeen, and Miss Kitty Stanley Green, were industriously engaged in supporting my mother and keeping up the home, the one working at her trade of a dressmaker, both at home and in the families of the well-to-do, and the other diligently occupying her time at home in whatever her hands could find to do. Mother, too, ate no idle bread, for what with the transacting of her domestic affairs and sewing on children's clothes for some of her patrons, Satan could find no mischief for her hands to do, and so she lived cosily, and for the most part happily, in that unpretentious home, for 27 more years, until she was in her 81st year of age, when she went to rest in the blessed hope of an immortal life. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. It is but fair that I should record it here that my dear sister, Mrs. Sarah Rice Green, Skeen, after the home was fully paid for, added $500 or $600 of her individual earnings to $135 which I contributed, and enhanced the convenience, space, and comfort of the old house, where they all lived in love and harmony for many years. One of my employers while I was working for the house was the late Captain J. M. Richards, who, with a gentleman long since deceased by the name of Coleman, owned and conducted a combined restaurant, saloon, billiard room, and cigar and confectionery stand, located on the corner where now stands the American Trust Building. This place was a resort for the best class of men in the city, and did a flourishing business. During the year 1864, I worked in the dining room and stalls for a while, quite to my advantage, and on one occasion a humorous incident occurred in which I figured, which was not entirely to my credit, as I now view it. One of the guests of the restaurant section of the place ordered a cocktail. I went into the bar-room, Captain Richards presiding behind the bar, and ordered 2 cocktails. The captain made them as only he could make them, and gave them to me, and going into the restaurant, I gave the guest one, and I drank the other. When the captain scrutinized the checks, he noticed that I had turned in a check for one cocktail only. Coming into the room, he said to me, "John, what did you do with that other cocktail?" I frankly answered him, "I drank it." Raising his hands in astonishment, he exclaimed, "Well, by God," and walked away. From Captain Richard's place I took employment with J. H. DeWitt and Company, who carried a dual stock of dry goods and ready-made clothing, etc., etc. My business was that of janitor, and in that capacity it was not only my duty to look after the heating of the store, but also to keep it clean, including several hundred square feet of window glass. My desire even here to study was so great that I was accustomed to arise at 3:30 and 4 o'clock a.m. in order to make time for my books. I had added to my studies now osteology, hoping and expecting some day to be a physician. A friendly doctor had given me the skull of a little child, another had contributed the transverse section of an adult skull, and in addition to these trophies I had obtained by various means almost an entire human skeleton. On one occasion, when I was deeply absorbed in my studies during the hour which I had made by sacrificing my sleep, a message was delivered to me to the effect that I must deliver a bundle somewhere in Prospect Street. I replied that it was not in the line of my employment, and that I would not deliver it. Thereupon I was summoned to the office of Mr. DeWitt, the senior member of the company. "John," he said, "you will deliver that bundle, or else go to the cashier and get what is due you." I said, "All right, Mr. DeWitt, I will take my money and quit then." As I left the store, Mr. DeWitt raised his voice and said to me, "Well, I suppose after a while you will want to have an office and sit in it and read." This was a correct prophecy, for it was uttered in the summer of 1865, and in the fall of 1870, September, I sat in my own office in Marlborough County, South Carolina, recognized as a member of the bar of the state. Following my discharge from the employment of the J. H. DeWitt Company, I entered the office of Dr. J. W. Sykes of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as a compounder of his medicines for chronic diseases, with the privilege of studying between the period of my employment, with the occasional assistance of the good doctor in my Latin studies. Dr. Sykes, too, was a self-made man with a heart overflowing with sympathy for every struggling child of God. I say child of God, yes, for Dr. Sykes was a member of the Presbyterian Church in good standing, and judging him by what I saw of his daily conduct during the 6 months I was in his employ, he was striving to glorify God and to enjoy him forever, which is one of the teachings of the Westminster Catechism. Dr. Sykes, when a student at Hamilton College, Rochester, New York, worked his way through, and paradoxical as it may seem, the lower he stooped in sawing wood, making fires, polishing shoes, and performing any and all menial labor which his hands found to do, the more honored and admired he was, until, attaining his cherished goal, he was crowned victor by his fellow students and all who had watched his efforts. I soon found in the employ of Dr. Sykes that my education was not such as the studying of medicine required, and this was especially true as regarded my knowledge of Latin, and the doctor, having been many years out of college, was not then qualified to instruct me therein, so we shook hands, expressed for each other gratitude and mutual respect, and separated. Returning to Cleveland, I entered for a brief space the employ of the Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati Railroad Company as a keeper of the castings and other materials used in the manufacture and repair of its locomotives and cars, taking occasion once in a while to make trips between Cleveland and Cincinnati on a double-day sleeping car. This was before the advent of the Pullman car in 1865. The distance from Cleveland and Cincinnati in those days was given as 250 miles, and it required 12 hours to make the trip one way. But still dissatisfied with my lot, I left this employment in search of a better one. I turned my job over to the late L.A. Wilson, Esquire, afterwards a distinguished member of the Ohio Bar in Cleveland. I now began to cast about for the means of prosecuting a course of studies under competent teachers, fully determined to persevere until I had secured a thorough education, for I had no trade or other definite means of living, although I had reached the 22nd year of my age. I conceived the idea of having printed in pamphlet form some of the essays of which I have spoken, but as I was entirely without financial means, it was necessary to find a friend in need, or else spend more precious time in laboriously earning some. I was well acquainted with one man who was both wealthy and benevolent, a true and tried friend of the youthful, and I decided that to him I would go and make known my dilemma, fully persuaded that my appeal would not be in vain. To have lived in Cleveland during the second half of the last century, and not to have been personally acquainted with the late Truman P. Handy would have been a distinctive loss to any one, especially to a youth in search of a stimulus along moral, aesthetic, or even financial lines. For Mr. Handy was above all things the friend and promoter of boys and young men. I first met Mr. Handy in the Mayflower Sunday School, located in Orange Street in the city of Cleveland, almost contiguous to the day school of the same name, in the fall of 1857, when he was in the 51st year of his age, and from that time until his death in the winter of 1898, I knew him to love and respect him. I can see him to this day and hear his cheery voice when, as superintendent of that Sunday school, he would mount the platform and exclaim, "Boys, what is heaven's first law?" "Order," was the unanimous response from the mouths of about 250 boys, who were about as disorderly as they could be. The girls, of course, were always orderly. "Well, then," retorted Mr. Handy, "let us have order." And immediately thereafter there was a delightful calm. "Order, if you please." One glance at Mr. Handy gave assurance that he was a Christian gentleman after the old school. That is to say, his toilet left nothing to be added to it. His dress was made to fit and of the most approved style. His demeanor and general bearing was that of a man unselfish, altruistic. He was easily approachable by the humblest boy or girl. He wasted no words, but gave a full hearing and thorough consideration to the one addressing him, and in proper cases afforded ready assistance. He was a deacon in the Second Presbyterian Church, of which the Reverend James Eales was the pastor, loved God, and always walked uprightly. He was born in Paris, Oneida County, New York, in March 1807, and during almost the whole of his lifetime was a banker acting in some important capacity, and he owned large interests in other enterprises. At the time of Mr. Handy's death in January 1898, he was 91 years of age and was a director of the Merchants National Bank, which was located on the northeast corner of Superior and West 6th Streets, Cleveland, he having resigned the presidency of that bank because of increasing age and failing health. He resided and transacted business in Cleveland from 1832 until 1898, 66 years. I may state in passing that for 10 years Mr. Handy was a member of the Cleveland Board of Education and did much towards establishing a high school for the city, and that along all educational lines, from Western Reserve University down to the humblest common school, he was a constant, earnest supporter, financially and otherwise. A few years before the death of Mr. Handy, Mr. John D. Rockefeller was visited at his home, Forest Hill, in East Cleveland, by a number of the foremost capitalists and men of business of Cleveland, who sought that method of manifesting to him their unbounded admiration and respect for him as a man and promoter of great financial affairs. Mr. Rockefeller, in replying to the address tendered to him, took occasion in his reminiscences to mention the name and laudable, generous characteristics of Mr. Handy, saying, amongst other things, that at a time in his early career as an oil dealer he found himself sorely in need of the sum of $2,000, and after seeking in vain to secure the loan of that amount, he finally approached Mr. Handy, who loaned it to him. This action on the part of the aged banker was entirely characteristic of him, and was readily understood by all present. Quite naturally, my mind turned to Mr. Handy in my quest of a person at once willing and able to assist me in my attempt to have my essays published. Gaining access to him in his private office in the rear of the bank, he recognized me at once as one of his boys. Although he had not seen me for several years, I related to him briefly what I had been doing during the 7 years previous, and received his commendation. Then I unfolded to him my scheme for raising money to systematize what education I had secured, inasmuch as I had no trade or other definite means of making a living. He gave my plans his hearty approval, provided the essays were worthy of publication, and advised me to carry them to the late Professor J. H. Thome, at that time acting in the dual capacity of professor in Oberlin College and pastor of Pilgrim Congregational Church in this city. Paradoxical as it may seem, Professor Thome, while in stature he was a small man, was yet a very large man. It is difficult to express an opinion as to whether his brain or his heart were the larger. Of one fact I am certain, however: he was the friend of the poor and needy of every race, for he was truly cosmopolitan in his thoughts and action. "Read one of your essays," exclaimed the professor, then bracing himself in his easy chair, he listened attentively while I read, with all the elocutionary ability at my command, an essay entitled, "We Are Never Alone." "Bravo, bravo!" he almost shouted when I had concluded the reading. "That will do." Then he wrote and handed to me a note addressed to Mr. Handy, in which he said, amongst other things, "They are well worthy of publication." I immediately delivered the note to Mr. Handy, and he in turn wrote and handed me a statement on a paper containing the letterhead of his bank, which ran somewhat as follows: "The bearer of this is an ex-member of the Mayflower Sunday School. I've known him from boyhood and have full confidence in him. He is trying to collect the means of publishing some essays which he has written, in order that, by the sale of them, he may secure money to assist him towards obtaining an education. T.P. Handy, $10. Now," he said, "go to Mr. Dan P. Ells and others of the Sunday School, and perhaps they will also subscribe." And turning to his desk, he gave his attention to his business, while I, filled with delight, went out into the world to see how many others would do likewise. I would that I could recall the names of all the kind-hearted men who signed that paper and subscribed sums varying from $5 to $10. I can recall that a very elderly banker, whose hand shook like an aspen, and last name was Otis, I think the full name was W.A. Otis, subscribed $10. A.S. Gardner, a crockery merchant, and E.I. Baldwin, large dry goods merchant, each subscribed $10. The others I cannot now recall. A total of some $60 or $70 was in this way raised by me. Then I went to Nevin, a job printer of standing at that time, and had the pamphlets printed. They were of 38 pages, fine print on cheap paper with red and yellow covers, and had the title of them printed on one side, "Essays on Miscellaneous Subjects by a Self-Educated Colored Youth." These essays I offered for sale in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, and the District of Columbia, with very success, receiving for single copies of them from 5 cents to $5. I had 2 experiences in the city of Philadelphia during my tour in selling my pamphlet, which were of more than ordinary interest and a lasting benefit to me. The first was that of meeting the Reverend Benjamin F. Tanner, a minister of the AME Church, who at that time was editor of the Christian Recorder and had his residence over the AME bookstore at 631 Pine Street. This was in the summer of 1866, when that reverend gentleman was in the flower of his youth, and was winning golden laurels by his oratory in the pulpit and his facile, trenchant pen in his sanctum. Since then he has reared and educated his brood of children, and grown to a ripe age as a bishop in that church. Reverend Tanner was greatly interested in me and my mission. He spoke encouraging words to me, and treated me in all respects as a brother. One mutual bond which held us together was that he was very much interested in the Vulgate edition of the Scriptures, while I too was a student of Latin in a humble way. Reverend Tanner opened the doors of old Allen Temple, which stood on the site of the blacksmith's shop in which the revered Richard Allen organized the first AME church, and scheduled a lecture for me on the subject. "There's always room enough upstairs." The lecture room, which was large, overflowed, and many could not gain entrance to hear my lecture, which enabled me at its conclusion to sell a large number of pamphlets. The reverend gentleman also gave me a letter of introduction to whom it concerned amongst the AME clergy, requesting them to aid and encourage me in my efforts to sell my pamphlet and to lecture. This was the open sesame to numerous churches, and aided me very much. Tanner, the great artist whose canvases hang in art galleries in Europe and America, is a son of Bishop Tanner, and I doubt not he derived his afflatus, his genius, largely from his revered and honored father. The other incident was meeting for the first time Reverend Dr. Hawes of the First Congregational Church of Philadelphia, and Mr. Theodore Bliss, brother of the late George Bliss of New York City, merchant, philanthropist, and one-time partner of the Governor Levi P. Morton of New York. I called on the reverend gentleman at his home, and he granted me an interview, in which I disclosed to him my plans for the future and the relation of my mission to them. He did what every true child of God does, every great big man. He took my hand, gave expression to words of encouragement, and bade me Godspeed. He did more. He mentioned me and my mission in his sermon on the following day, and invited me to meet him in his Sunday school in the afternoon. The boys and girls accepted the invitation and nearly filled the Sunday school room, listening to my plea for assistance in my chosen way for the future, and I had the pleasure of selling a large number of my little books at the conclusion of the address. Some $35, if I mistake not, was the aggregate amount received. At the conclusion of my address, which ended with a thrilling peroration, at least that was the effect intended, a large gentleman of noble mien arose and in clear tones said, "Mr. Superintendent, will you ask that young gentleman to tell us what he thinks of Jesus?" This came with great surprise, for I had not intended to preach, but simply to make an unvarnished statement of my plans and hope and expectations. Nevertheless, I was equal to the emergency. I rose again and answered briefly but forcibly that neither education, money, nor social place could avail a person if he were not imbued with the Spirit of Jesus Christ, as manifested in his daily life. This seemed to satisfy every one, and I left the church highly elated. The most important result for me growing out of this meeting, however, was my introduction to Mr. Theodore Bliss, as I have stated above. I was invited to meet him at his office, then in a building in 4th Street, where he carried on the business of a publisher. Indeed, I hold in my hand now a little Greek Testament from the press of Theodore Bliss and Company, which I have owned ever since 1865. Mr. Theodore Bliss was what we commonly call a self-made man. He was sent out into the world at an early age to shift for himself, and that rich Puritan blood which coursed in his arteries carried him through to the end. He was large of stature, with a high, broad forehead and firmly set jaws, which proved him to be a man of high purpose, fixed resolution, and great good judgment and energy. His eyes, looking out from under heavy brows, were clear and penetrating, marking him as a man at once judicious and practical. Mr. Bliss said to me, in substance, "Go home, settle down, find some useful remunerative employment to engage your intervals between the terms. And if, by following my advice, you find yourself in need of the necessities of life, write to me, and I will help you." I thanked him and took my departure. Later on in life, while attending school, I once in a while found my toes peeping out from my boots, and Jack Frost through each crack and crevice creeping. Upon 2 or 3 occasions like this, I notified my friend, and the returning mail invariably brought me a $10 bill, the exact cost price of a pair of new boots. There was another good friend in Philadelphia, whose acquaintance I made through the courtesy and kindness of the Reverend William Alston, Episcopal priest, of whom I have spoken at length in the first chapter. I refer to a large dealer in wooden and willow ware, whose warehouse was located downtown in Market Street, by the name of Jacobus, if I mistake not. This gentleman, who was largely interested in the Pennsylvania Railroad at that time, extended to me an invitation to take a theological course for the Episcopal ministry, but I declined with thanks. I have suspected since then that I made a mistake, for I fear I spoilt a good preacher as well as a good doctor in making a poor lawyer. Subsequently, this same gentleman procured for me a clergyman's railroad ticket from Philadelphia to my Cleveland home. Arriving home, I gave my dear mother $135 of the money received in my wanderings, and then began to scan the field to discover a school into which I could matriculate, in order to do the systematizing of which I spoke to Mr. Handy. I had a consuming desire to enter a class in the Central High School, but how could a waiter boy, coming directly from the dining room, where he had been for 6 or 7 years, expect to pass examination and enter that famous school? I say famous, yes, and advisedly, for then the chairs were occupied by such ripe scholars as the following: Dr. Theodore Sterling, Principal; Professor Sidney A. Norton; Miss Mary E. Ingersoll; Miss Emma G. Barris; subsequently Mrs. Colonel McAllister; Miss White; Professor of Carl Kruger; Professor Theodore Hopkins, and others. And amongst the students were such as Charles F. Brush, Horace Andrews, Samuel Mather, Dr. John Lohman, W. E. Cushing, Harvey D. Goulder, Joseph Althwaite, Clarence Stilson, Solomon Schwab, the late Mr. C.O. Bassett, afterwards well known and appreciated by me as the president of the great Foreman Bassett Company of Cleveland, Ohio, who by his great business ability, sterling integrity, and great good humor put his house at the head of all similar organizations in Ohio, and a number of ambitious, successful young ladies. In those days, Mr. Mather's sterling qualities as a student were already quite noticeable, and even then his generous impulses, as manifested during his intercourse amongst his fellow students, forecasted his future life of usefulness and broad humanitarianism. I saw more of Mr. Mather in the Virgil class than elsewhere, and it was then easily evident to my mind that his superior quality of intellect and his deep touch of nature were destined to stamp him as one of our nation's greatest and most useful men. I never see Mr. Mather, even at this late date, without recalling the manly port and dignified bearing of his distinguished father. The late deceased William E. Cushing was also one of the class of 1869, who in after years became conspicuous because of his sterling manhood and professional ability. Will Cushing frequently invited me to visit him at the home of his late father, Dr. H. K. Cushing, in Euclid Avenue near the public square, where we strove with varying success to unravel the mysteries of Virgil together. I mourn his loss. My old maxim was naught venture, naught have, or as we sometimes say, nothing venture, nothing win. So straight to the school I went, and at a convenient time I stood in the august presence of Dr. Stirling, who questioned me as to the nature and extent of the studies which I had prosecuted, and accepted one of my pamphlets which I offered him, and closed the conference between us by inviting me to visit him at his home the evening of that day for a further interview. At his home in the evening, Dr. Stirling said to me in substance, "Green, you have done well in your studies without an instructor, as I have gleaned from a hurried perusal of your little book. But your studies have not been systematically pursued, and I'm certain you could not pass an examination to enter the high school. But I will give you a list of books which you will need, and you may obtain them and come to the school tomorrow forenoon, and I will see where I can place you." I did as directed, and on the following day, in the month of October, I think I found myself duly installed in the sophomore class of the Cleveland Central High School, which was still located in Euclid Avenue near East 9th Street, where the great Citizens Savings and Trust Company is now located. In this class, which was composed of the sons and daughters of some of the foremost citizens of Cleveland, I was the only colored pupil, but my color evidently was not considered in any way. Dr. Stirling and every member of his learned corps of instructors were colorblind, and the only watchword recognized by them was merit. The studies which the class was engaged in, as nearly as I can recall, were Cornelius Nepos in Latin, algebra, geometry, English history, English composition, physical geography, calisthenics, and rhetoricals. Later on in the course I had chemistry, physics, and Greek, Xenophon's Anabasis, and 1,000 lines of Homer's Iliad. It took me from October 1866 to July 1869 to devour the 4 years' course, and it was said I stood at the finish well near the head of the class, which contained some names which have since become famous, but I have never felt that I was as thoroughly grounded in my studies as the other members of the class were, for I entered the class late. I was not properly prepared for the courses which I studied. I did not have adequate time in which to prepare my lessons, and above all, I felt then and still believe that some of the students were my intellectual superiors. While I attended the high school, Dr. Stirling permitted me to leave the room 10 minutes before the others were dismissed at noon, in order that I might reach the hotel and earn my dinner in the dining room as a waiter, and during the time I was studying Greek, I slept in a garret sharing the bed of a man who had a terribly diseased scalp, in order to obtain a free lodging and husband my small means. I regularly arose at 3 o'clock a.m., and by the uncertain light of a small pear-shaped oil lamp with one round wick, I studied my Greek lessons in order that I might be ready to serve in the dining room for my breakfast at the sound of the bell. During the first year of my attendance in the high school, I worked a second time in the old Union Depot dining room for my board. I waited on 16 depot officials and clerks every morning, and when I suggested that since I received my board only for all this work, I ought to be allowed to sweeten my cup of coffee with white granulated sugar, the head waiter, not Thorpe Holmes, forbade me to use it, restricting me to some very dark brown sugar. I appealed to Mr. Wheeler. He sustained the decision of the head waiter, and I quit him and went to the old Birch House, then located on the east side of West 9th Street, near the corner of Frankfort Street, and presided over by Mr. and Mrs. Gillette, kind and generous people who I fear have long since gone to their rich reward. Mrs. Gillette's father, Father Birch, was very old and feeble. I had the honor and pleasure of watching over him the whole of one night, and hourly administering to him his prescribed medicine. In his youth, Father Birch had been personally acquainted with Chancellor Kent, whose voluminous and learned commentaries were familiar to all students of law a generation ago. Mr. Byron Hunt, a handsome, good-natured specimen of manhood, later on, when I was a husband and father, loaned me $5 after all other friends had failed me. In gratitude I shall carry the memory of his kindness to my grave with me. During all the time of my high school experiences, I devoted a number of my nights to waiting on parties and weddings. I shall never forget that when the late Senator M.A. Hanna and his beautiful bride, the daughter of the late Dan P. Rhodes, were married, I was one of those who, in the dining-room, ministered to their wants. The same is true as regards the wedding of Colonel Harris of the United States Army and a lovely daughter of the late Stillman Witt, a sister, I think, of Mrs. Dan P. Eales, of the city, by the way. When I was graduated and had floral offerings literally rained down on me, I wore one of the late Dan P. Eales' discarded coats, given to me by Mrs. Eales. It was a dark brown broadcloth coat. End of chapter 5.